Hello and welcome to this video on the mind-controlling Hist Trees from the Elderscrolls universe. Like everything else in Elderscrolls, the Hist Trees just work, but importantly, the way they work is described as a race of sentient trees and known basically being their earth. The trees at once spread far and wide, but were, theoretically, eventually beaten back to only a small area called Blackmarsh. The Hist Trees are, effectively, able to use the Argonian race as a quasi-slave race. We say slave race as they seem to exert some, if not an extreme degree of mind control over Argonians at times. The Hist Trees are like Twitch personalities in that regard. As per the wiki page, the Hist Tree is a kind of tree in appearance, and some say they are mobile, although this has not been verified beyond rumour. They not only draw water as a source of nourishment, but also seem to contain in that water a repertoire of memories. There is some argument as to whether or not this is a literal or figurative statement. The Hist are supposed to be interconnected with each other, and because of this can communicate with one another through that link. They also communicate with species that are not Hist Trees, by ingestion of their sap, at least in the right way and time. This is why the Argonians are considered to be part of them, or at least on a level that is potentially biological. The Hist roots stretch very deep into the heart of Nirn and theoretically further out than just Blackmarsh. The Hist trees are sometimes described as having large hanging flowers which can be red or blue. One tribe is said to have Hist trees that are growing ice-like or icicle flowers in turn, although again this may or may not be a literal thing. The Hist will produce sap as mentioned, and this is used by the Argonians, their quasi-slave race, but the Argonians use it in a variety of cultural practices, essentially getting high. But it's also supposed to stimulate particular growth patterns in Argonians, which can then in turn determine gender. The sap also induces some visions for Argonians, and these are perceived as a sacred experience. Other races also consume Hist tree sap, and well, it's valued for what it is, a drug.
Drugs are bad. You shouldn't do drugs. If you do them, you're bad, because drugs are bad, okay?
And certainly tainted samples can be a hallucinogen. If you consume enough of it, it is poisonous. The Hist tree sap will bleed from the Hist tree roots, and this is known as a deep sap. Unlike other examples from our Unpossible playlist, this is actually quite a lot of information to work with and from, more so in the context of mind control. We are still going to start going down the speculation rabbit hole eventually, but it'll be later than usual for these videos. Starting with the Argonians, we can speculate about the following mechanisms, and we say speculate in a more loose sense than usual. First, you need to be an attractive Argonian female. Now set up a basic webcam and broadcast yourself on Twitch. Wait, wrong kind of mind control again. The Hist produce a sap, and this plays a central role in Argonian biology and culture. Argonians consume this sap during rituals, and particularly during their coming-of-age ceremonies, and this is going to have a significant impact on their cultural zeitgeist, and essentially create a powerful connection between the Argonians and the Hist trees. The sap is suggested, and we say that very loosely, to influence Argonian psychology, personality, and even their souls. We say loosely because, well, souls are relatively intangible and therefore practically impossible to prove the existence of in a real world, although they do exist in the Elderscrolls universe. As for psychology and personality, well, drugs are a hell of a thing. In terms of soul and identity influence, things are a little more direct. The sap is supposed to be the source of Argonian souls, and shape their existence, and guide them through life and death. Just look at what happens with meth. Further, upon death, an Argonian soul is said to return to the Hist trees. This is thought to be a almost symbolic, or if not symbiotic, link that could be what allows the Hist trees to influence the Argonians through thoughts and actions. Then again, it could just be really good drugs, and this plays a bigger role, let's say, in visions and guidance. The Hist tree sap can induce visions, and it's supposed to provide guidance, as seen in various Argonian cultural practices. Although then again, if you take enough drugs, you might go off and fight a big bear.
Big drugs kill a bear.
The visions that are seen can have an effect on Argonian behavior, and this is possibly a case of a more subtle form of mind control. The Hist trees implanting more of an idea rather than a directive. An example of this is during the Oblivion crisis, the Hist Trees are supposed to have called all the Argonians back to Blackmarsh, and in doing so also helped to enhance their combat abilities. This means that not only can the Hist Trees have an effect on individuals, but essentially all Argonians on a species level at a very large scale in terms of geography. Hallucinogenic effects are fairly straightforward. Basically, any non-Argonian consuming a reasonably large quantity of Hist Tree sap will have hallucinogens and possibly enter into a state of bloodlust. This is seen with what the Blackwood Company was doing in the Elderscrolls 4. What they were doing was taking the tree sap and using it essentially as a drug, which again, we throw you back to the earlier point of drugs are a hell of a thing. The difference in this case is that we think it might actually be something closer to meth, only because of Florida Man. The Florida Man not only exhibits extreme power, but also has a very loose sense of a mental state, let's call it. And so, we could see how this could be potentially overriding free will. Exactly the same thing it happens with the Argonians, and for that matter, any other species that consumes enough of it. The Hist Tree sap, at least in the case of the Blackwood Company, also induced violent behaviour, even in the Argonians, meaning that it could well be that, although not necessarily the sole, let's say, active compound, a meth is produced somehow by the Hist Trees. We then have the physical and mental enhancement. As mentioned, during major events such as the Oblivion crisis, the Hist are able to modify their sap, and this did enhance Argonian strength, but also aggression and combat prowess. That allowed them to not necessarily deal, but at least repel Daedric invasions in Blackmarsh. This would suggest that the sap can temporarily alter both physiological states and mental states to serve the tree's goals. This would again be more in line, let's say, with various drugs that we see now, that significantly change what somebody's experiencing and how well they can respond to instructions. There's been a recent spate, let's call it, of various drugs being used to essentially create zombies that can then follow very, very loose instructions and commit crimes. In terms of the prophetic visions and insights the Argonians experience, well, it would be possible that the tree minders using their sap are able to achieve something very similar to, say, peyote, where you instead go out into the desert and you see a fox.
North, please. North? Good Lord, this can't be happening. Our medical logic seems to be shooting out of his ears. His ears if we're lucky. Well, Chief, don't quit your day job. Whatever that is. My finest dollar. And Marge wasn't even here to see it. Ooh, I don't feel so good. Magnus, you gotta help me. Sure, buddy, I'll be happy to help out. What can I do? Diddly doo, diddly doo, diddly doo.
Hey!
Goo goo goo. Let him go, Ralph. He knows what he's doing.
Well, at least if you're an obese American. In the case of Argonians, probably something less, let's say, animalistic. In terms of the behaviour influence, well, the sap does have the ability to not only subtly, but rather more egregiously alter, or at least change Argonian behaviour, and this is supposed to align their actions with the Hist's will. Murkmire within the Elderscrolls universe has Argonian tribes that have almost obsessive behaviours, temple building mostly, and this is caused by consumption of the Hist Tree sap, and it would suggest, if not outright demonstrate, that the sap can induce not only compulsive but fanatical devotion to the Hist Trees. But again, we would go back to the idea of drugs. Drugs will make people do very dumb shit, very frequently, to get another hit. The influence is not always overt, and can sometimes be far more subtle, such as manifesting a deep sense of purpose or loyalty to the Hist Trees. But then again, drugs. People, once they're addicted, have a lot of dedication to getting their next hit. Direct mind manipulation is the next option, and this is probably the stronger case to be made here. The Hist Trees are rather, let's say, nebulously credited with abilities that would align with magic that control your mind. If we look at, let's say, magic as being theoretically feasible, well, the lore within the Elderscrolls universe would indicate that the Hist Trees can manipulate minds directly, and this is demonstrated through both changing the Argonian souls and influencing their real-world physical body behavior. We would argue that this is probably not something that we can really go into a great deal of depth on, only because we would argue that any sufficiently advanced science is going to be considered magic, and drugs are science. Chemistry mostly, but science. Then we have Umbriel's Hist, and this is a floating island, and the floating island appears to contain Hist Trees. Now, it's important to note that this may just be a random in-universe example of sort of a tree popping up somewhere, or possibly the Hist Trees actually demonstrating a modicum of self-control and sentience, allowing them to, let's say, spread their power further. In more, let's say, a grounded reasoning, we have neurochemical manipulation. This is pharmaceuticals and or similar substances. In short, drugs, or at least natural drugs. The mechanisms are a little more difficult to talk about because all we really know is that you drink something that comes from a tree and suddenly you lose your ability to engage in critical thinking, and sometimes it can induce compliance. This is more akin to a date rape drug than it is intoxication, but technically the two are the same. That is, being drugged that way is technically intoxication, although it generally follows intoxication with other kinds of drugs first. In terms of the Hist Tree, although not quite the same outcome, it could well be a psychoactive substance, a sedative, or even some kind of, let's say, more novel compound designed to target a specific neural pathway within the Argonians particularly, but that a parallel compound is active in the, let's say, human brain or other races that has an effect on causing, in some cases, euphoria, and in excessive doses, death. A hypothetical compound would be something like, say, a dopamine or serotonin analog, but not necessarily so. Importantly, what it would need to do is target the prefrontal cortex to impair decision-making, but also increasing susceptibility to external influence. Implementing such a drug is, let's say, challenging, especially so in the more covert manner in which it's normally consumed. For example, in this case, as a tree sap. But in other cases, it is thought that it might theoretically be able to be aerosolized, allowing for a, let's say, controlled delivery in the environment around the Hist Tree. So, if you were to, for example, be an Argonian, and you were to go to your Hist Tree and engage in your, let's say, religious or cultural rites, you get your hit of the drug. You leave the Hist Tree, suddenly you're feeling down and probably experiencing withdrawal symptoms, let's call them. As a result, you now have a reason to want to protect the giant great big tree that is effectively controlling your life. This is, let's say, things that have been experimented on in our reality. The precedents for this include things like MKUltra, where LSD was tested extensively in all kinds of exciting and interesting ways. But more modern advancements in psychopharmacology could theoretically provide more evidence if it was a real-world thing. The limitations, however, are that just about every drug has a temporary effect. It will vary by individual, and of course, well, as we would know from the fact that we're talking about this, a risk detection. So obviously, it's a fairly good argument that, well, let's be blunt about this. The Hist Trees are making a drug, it's just what kind isn't very clear. Now, given the seemingly subtle impact it's having, we might instead argue it's more of a subliminal stimuli, or perhaps more of a, even arguably a neuromarketing mechanism, something that is used to a very limited extent today, particularly in media, to try and get you to buy whatever the thing is. Most recently, let's say the newest iPhone or MacBook. What it does is stimulate very specific parts of your brain to tell you, you feel good now because you've done this thing. For example, opening the Apple packaging. And so you think, okay, I want to do this again, or I want to see it. And it allows for very, very subtle subliminal messaging. In the case of the Argonians, given the, let's call it, greater frequency and extreme volume of exposure they have to the Hist Tree toxin, it would make sense to some extent that they would be able to experience it on a more, let's say, advanced level. This is why the subliminal cues involved could well be, let's say, ubiquitous the way they are. Literally, the history is such an essential and core part of their culture and society that it has become so utterly integrated that the ability to, let's call it, differentiate whether or not it's giving you a subliminal message or it's just part of life is almost entirely gone. This is arguably far less plausible, but still an interesting, let's say, area to explore in terms of why it is that they do what they do. There are a few more, as we mentioned very early on, speculative mechanisms, and while we can't explicitly say they're detailed in the lore, there are ways that the history might be able to exert its mind-controlling-like powers. First of all, we have telepathic communication, which probably not the case, although it might well be. It's thought that the history might be able to communicate telepathically with Argonians, which suggests not only does the tree have to have consciousness, but also the ability to, let's say, demonstrate higher cognitive functions. Now yes, we do know that trees, to some extent in our world, can communicate, whether it's via, say, the mycorrhiza allowing the transfer of various signals from one tree to another, or one species to another, and that a plant can scream when they're in danger, and so on. But doing so from a plant to, say, an animal, not so much. In fact, in order to hear plants screaming, we actually need very specialized, very dedicated microphones. So, although yes, unless the, let's say, Argonians have a very, very close symbiotic relationship, it's unlikely that they could telepathically implant thoughts or directives into their minds. This is not to say it's not possible, and we'll get to that in due course. There's another way that could happen. Then we have chemical manipulation, and, well, this is literally just drugs, sex, and rock and roll. Less of the rock and roll and sex, but definitely more of the drug side of things. The Hist sap might have various psychoactive compounds that can essentially stuff with the Argonian brain chemistry, and this would make them not just more compliant, but very much susceptible to suggestion or control by the Hist trees. More so when we start talking about, say, hallucinogenic properties, wherein, depending on exactly what kind of hallucinogenic properties are held, might lead to them being, let's say, almost indoctrinated, or in other cases, essentially terrified into doing whatever it is, traumatized if you will. There's also soul binding, although we'll skip over most of the issues around soul binding because soul doesn't exist, but in the Elderscrolls universe they do, so theoretically, if rather than having the Hist trees communicate to the Argonians' physical body but their soul, that might be a way to do so. Now we need to talk about this in the context of non-Argonians, because they are a majority of the population on Nirn, because, well, just about every other population is non-Argonian. So we have a whole range of different species, and we'll not really worry too much about differentiating them, as there's some issues to do with how different species would respond, which we don't want to get into here. The Hist tree sap has a somewhat more unpredictable and dangerous effect on most non-Argonian species, and this does seem to be part of the whole issue around differences in physiology, and to a lesser extent a lack of natural attunement to the Hist tree sap, and this does lead to rather adverse reactions. To use a simple comparison with humans like coffee, or at least caffeine. Giving caffeine to, say, a dog will kill them. So, obviously, very different situations. This is why, to some extent, the hallucinogenic and psychoactive effects tend to be, let's say, more pronounced in the Argonians, unless we're talking about a corrupted Hist tree, which can lead to issues around hallucinations, but also leads to issues around blood loss and loss of self-control. Obviously, one of these is not so great if you want to be selling drugs. The psychoactive properties can also affect non-Argonian minds to a much greater extent, leading to things like disorientation, aggression, or altered perception. This would indicate that the sap is, let's say, tailored to Argonian biology, but there may be another reason for this, and we'll get to that again in due course, but it would, let's say, prop up our argument that it is very much a drug, and a psychoactive drug, rather than being the other aforementioned mechanisms, let's call it. Addiction and dependency supports this, as the Hist tree sap can lead to a very significant degree of dependency, and because of the great reliance on it, you basically lose any and all autonomy. While mirroring addiction, there is some slight differences, but overall it is, for all intents and purposes, the same basic idea. This is further demonstrated through the Hist Tree-like substance consumed from Umbriel's trees, which appear to have been so heavily integrated into the island's ecosystem that it's almost a, let's say, mutation that creates another form of chemical enslavement. It has altered the behavior and loyalty of all the creatures and plants there. Physically, the Hist Tree is rather harmful to non-Argonians, and to a lesser extent even Argonians, depending on how you want to look at this. The, let's say, consumption of large quantities of sap can lead to physical harm or death, given varying degrees of potency, and because its effects aren't really, let's say, for lack of a better word, tailored to non-Argonian physiology, the toxicity is much more substantial. We want to talk about now the psychoactive and mind control mechanisms particularly, because the mechanisms that we do see, given that there's Argonians who are affected one particular way and non-Argonians affected another way, might be a little easier to understand. And it seems, for the most part, to be altering neurotransmitter activity, and that in turn induces visions euphoria, and at least for Argonians, a degree of, susceptibility to being told what to do. For other non-Argonian species, well, it will, as mentioned, amplify aggression, but also reduce free will, and this is not so helpful in many ways, but as mentioned, there are parallel drugs, let's call them, that are out there today that do something somewhat similar. We also want to mention that there is a possibility, let's call it, that consumption of the Hist Tree sap might amplify the Argonians' receptivity to psychic messages from the Hist Tree, whether that is psychic as in their physical body or their spiritual body, either one. But again, we'll try and stick to something a little more solid here. In terms of the Hist Tree's actual influence, it is not absolute mind control, at least not in the traditional sense of the word, at least not by comparison to other similar events in the Elderscrolls universe, for example, Molag Bal's invasive and rather significant mental torture of Amina. It's more like a more subtle guidance, and you might almost argue it's a compulsion, and more so for Argonians than anyone else. And part of this is going to be because the Hist Tree is seen as a spiritual guide by the Argonians. This, however, might be a bit of a mixed bag, simply because non-Argonians seem to be less affected by the Hist Tree sap, but they also consume less of it, which may be why they're not as notably affected in terms of things like being told what to do by the Hist Trees. On the other side, because the Argonians have not just consumed a lot of it, but for a very long time and over many, many generations, they might have developed a certain, let's call it resistance as a species. And so, although they would otherwise have been susceptible to compulsion, they've developed that resistance, therefore not quite as much of a susceptibility as they might otherwise have. There's also the fact that the Hist Tree does seem to have some modicum of control over how potent the Hist sap is, and that is indicated by the Oblivion crisis, where the Hist Tree appeared to produce much stronger sap, which had a more significant effect. While the Hist Tree saps are powerful, they do have limitations, as mentioned. At least for the Argonian specific limitations, the sap is most effective and harmonious with them. It seems their biology is just able to cope better with it. Non-Argonians, not so much. And of course, there is the question of what about the corrupt Hist Tree sap? And that would indicate that that behaves very differently again, so we don't want to go too far down that pathway. This does raise a final possibility though, and it's the idea of a parallel evolution that favours the Hist Tree, and that in turn has led to the myth of the Hist Tree mind control powers to be grossly exaggerated. In this case, the Hist Tree has traits that made it desirable to the Argonians. They fed on the sap and became intoxicated. This led to the Argonians sort of farming the Hist Tree, the same way ants farm aphids. The difference is that the ants in this case choose to be farmed, thereby being protected, similar to how, say, we domesticated cats, or it'd be better to say cats domesticated humans. In the case of the Hist tree, it in turn leads to the traits that make the Hist tree desirable being retained and promoted through pressure to be a source of sap drugs. This leads to Argonians being more motivated and pressured to keep the Hist tree alive because it's the source of their drug. Over time, that relationship has become distorted into a myth about the Hist tree having mind control powers, where it was originally just a sort of a symbiotic relationship. But that also created a cultural and social structure around it, in which the Hist tree is a almighty power, and so long as you do right by the almighty power in the form of the Hist tree, they will give you drugs. It sounds rather questionable, but this is also, it's the Elder Scrolls universe. There are many questionable things. Importantly, though, we want to mention that it would be a strong case of evolutionary forces coming into play, both in terms of, say, the cultural aspects, the social aspects, the physiological aspects, and everything else, wherein there's a certain symbiosis between the Argonians and the Hist trees, allowing the Argonians to have developed a somewhat greater propensity towards being able to detect and understand signals from the Hist trees, and the Hist trees in turn being able to, let's say, work with them closer, particularly when it comes to looking after themselves. And because the Argonians have become dependent on the Hist trees for their happy drugs, they do so quite willingly. The Hist trees' mind control powers seem to stem from, at least in terms of the Hist trees themselves, a hive mind, but more importantly the psychoactive properties of their sap and a very deep cultural and spiritual connection to the Argonians. Now, whether or not we want to argue that this is by shaping their souls, or inducing visions and potentially telepathy, or in extreme cases magic, they still have an effect, and that effect manipulates the behavior in Argonians particularly. The sap is, as noted, able to affect other species, but the results are very unpredictable, and it would indicate that there is a, let's say, awareness within the Hist trees, along with a fairly clear-cut case of symbiosis, allowing the Hist trees to exert a rather mysterious force, arguably, but it's not necessarily true that that is what they're doing. This may just be a very convenient explanation as to what is a fairly straightforward process. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.